Hi, my name is Albert Cigaroa, and this is the week 7 persuasive speech. My topic is going to be for the death penalty, capital punishment, and it's endorsing the sentence. So, here we have life, liberty, and justice for all. And here we have the blind lady of justice from Greek mythology, and she's blind, implying that justice is blind. She has the scales, meaning it only evidences weight in the decision. So here we go. Capital punishment. So capital punishment has always been used since the early 1600s, dating back to the biblical times. Capital punishment has always been a sentence that we as society has used to punish offenses that we've deemed that are heinous or the most critical is crimes. There's a case, Gregg versus Georgia. And this case is significant because it actually placed a stay on executions. Gregg was convicted of armed robbery, and during the commission of his crime, a murder did occur. He filed an appeal after he was given a death sentence in a Georgia state court. His appeal was one of 5 appeals. After he appealed, then there was appeals from Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and all of them are claiming that capital punishment was against their personal rights. The 8th and 14th Amendment, more specifically, cruel and unusual punishment. So the Supreme Court ruled in a 7-2 decision saying that capital punishment, the death sentence, was not an infringement on those rights, as long as it was added judiciously and carefully. Now, the provisions for capital punishment, when you are in a capital case, you have your trial. Okay, the defendant goes to trial, the evidence is presented, they're found guilty with beyond a reasonable doubt. Then they go to the sentencing phase of the trial. Now in the sentencing phase, the jury deliberates on whether the death sentence is warranted or not. They look at things like criminal history, details of the crime, things of that sort. And based on that information, they make the recommendation or they hand down the death sentence to the individual. So they're actually found guilty twice, once for the crime and then again for the death sentence. So in the way that death sentence is applied, the Supreme Court ruled that it was not unjust the way that it was applied. And the only thing that in that rule that came about on those lawsuits was also the fact determining sentences. So what that means is the death sentence was eliminated as a mandatory sentence. So let's say the defendant got found guilty of a capital punishment crime. He's guilty, he automatically gets the death sentence. Now they wrote that is unconstitutional because, again, it's not placed judiciously or carefully. So that was done away with. But in the way that it's applied, where he's tried twice, it's just, and the Supreme Court upheld it. And there's more information there if you want to look up the case. Okay, and one thing that right now with the split against the death sentence or against the death sentence, human rights activists, they argue that it's killing, that it's state-sponsored killing. But capital punishment is actually, it fits in with the 2 main theories of punishment within our criminal justice system. And what that is for retribution and utilitarian. So retribution meaning they did the crime, you do the crime, you do the time. That's a utilitarian point of view. So you committed the heinous act, then capital punishment, that is the prescribed antidote for what the defendant did. So like, for example, you get a speeding ticket, you pay a fine. So you commit capital murder, you get handed the death sentence. And the utilitarian view is to restore justice. It restores it in that it gives the victims and their families closure. So that's the 2 main theories behind punishment that exist in our criminal justice system. That's how capital punishment fits into those models. Okay, so here we're going to have a case study. Some of these details about the case, they are disturbing. Keep in mind they are capital cases. And just as we go through these slides, just keep in mind that these are individuals that you could possibly encounter out in the community. Just imagine this person being, saved from the death penalty, and he's either out on parole or he's still alive in prison. Okay, so Joseph Edward Duncan. In 2005, he broke into a home in Idaho. Okay, he slipped in through a back door, and he came up on Brenda growing. And what he did was first he secured her hands with a zip tie, and he held her up with a shotgun. Once he secured her, then he told her, call Mark McKenzie, which was her fiance. So she calls out to Mark. Mark comes downstairs, and Joseph Duncan, he takes him, apprehends him, and uses a zip tie to secure him. Then he does the same thing with Slade, their 13-year-old son. So he's got all three family members. They're tied up with zip ties there in the living room. He then takes two kids, the two younger kids, Shasta and Dylan. Shasta was 8 and Dylan was 9 at the time. He takes them, places them in a red Jeep Cherokee, and then returns back to where he has the family zip tied and proceeds to bludgeon them to death with a hammer. Shasta would later testify to the police that she saw her brother stumbling through the hallway after he was assaulted. She would also testify that she heard her mother's boyfriend cry out in pain, and she also heard her mother cry. So the kids, just imagine, they're inside this red Jeep Cherokee. They don't know who this individual is, and they can hear their family members screaming and pleading for their life as Mr. Duncan is in there committing those murders. Now, once he commits those murders, he jumps into the Jeep Cherokee and drives to a secluded area in Montana. So he crosses state lines. Okay, he keeps them there for several weeks, and the abuse continues. He repeatedly sexually abuses them. He tortures Dylan. He tells them that he's gonna kill him, and then he promises to take them back. You know, he really put him through a lot. In the end, he ends up killing Dylan. He ends up murdering Dylan. And then he tells Shasta, I'm gonna take you back. I'm gonna take you back home. So they leave the Montana wilderness, and this is a picture of them. They were caught on camera entering a convenience store. They went to a Denny's, and while they were at Denny's, the waitress noticed Shasta and then called the authorities. And Mr. Duncan was taken into custody without any incident. Now, this is a picture. In this picture right here, this is Shasta now. That's her grown. She's an adult now. But Dylan, Slade, Brenda, and Mark, all 4 were murdered. So she's an orphan. This guy killed all her family. And on top of that, he sexually abused her. So not only is she a sole survivor of the murder, she is also a sexual crime survivor. So she has to deal with the mental ailments from that. And Shasta, she goes on to do a year in juvie, from juvenile detention for alcohol and drug abuse. And she attributes those to the experiences that she felt from this crime. So this crime that Duncan committed actually ends up leading her going into a detention facility later on in life as she tries to cope with the things that transpired. Now, there was no eyewitnesses to the crime, so that meant the police went mainly based off of Shasta's testimony. So Shasta gave chilling detailed accounts of what happened. She details the abuse of young Dylan, his murder. She tells police, she testifies, and she is the star witness by all accounts, and also a laptop that Duncan had because he recorded some of the abuses that would take place. She described one incident where Dylan was actually tied by his wrists, and Duncan assaulted him, kicking him in the genitals, and even reportedly told Duncan told Dylan that he was the devil and God wasn't there to save him. So this is just the type of things that he did to them out there in the wilderness. Okay, and they go to trial. So the trial, it was complicated because during the course of the trial, since he crossed state lines, federal prosecutors picked up the case as well. It became a federal case. Since they crossed federal lines, he sexually abused those kids and murdered Dylan. It became a federal case. But he was tried in the Idaho State Court first, where he was found guilty for the murders of the mom, Mark, and Slade. So he pled guilty, and he was given 3 life sentences. Then the federal prosecutors took over. And during the course of the investigation, They found that he was actually involved in two other cases, one in California and one in Washington. Both were young boys where they were actually assaulted and then murdered. So they, over here pictured to the right, this first picture right here is his booking picture. He's 17 years old in that picture. And he was arrested for sexual crimes. He ends up doing 18 years in prison for that offense. He will go on to tell therapists that by the time he was 16, he had committed over 12 counts of rape, mainly on young boys. He gets out, and these pictures on the bottom were taken off his personal blog. He had a blog called The Fifth Nail, which he expressed his hatred towards law enforcement, his hatred towards the Sexual Predator Registry Program, and how he wasn't happy with it. So later, he would get out. He gets out of prison, right? It's the year 2000. He's in Minnesota. In 2004, he gets arrested for molesting a 5-year-old boy on a playground. So they book him. Well, since he didn't have any recent criminal offenses, they released him on a $15,000 bond. So he makes bond, and then he skips that bond. So now he's a fugitive. While he was a fugitive, that's when he committed those crimes in Idaho, where he murdered that whole family and left Shasta as an orphan. So during the course of that, the federal prosecutors, they sought the death penalty on him, and he was found guilty, and he was handed a death sentence. Currently, he's awaiting in Terre Haute in Indiana, and he's on death row there. So this individual here is dangerous. This is him from when he was a little boy, all the way up until he was captured for the murder of Shasta's family. So the question is, does an individual like this, can he be rehabilitated? Would you feel comfortable going to Walmart knowing that there's individuals like this out there? Or how would you feel from a family standpoint if this individual was allowed to live? If he was allowed to have life in prison without parole? And this is Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader he's known as BTK, blind, torture, and kill. He would send letters to law enforcement, and on the bottom he would sign that bind, torture, and kill. That was his moniker, so to speak. So he was known as BTK. He murdered 10 people in Wichita Falls from the time of 1974 to 1991. He would claim responsibility for these murders. He would send letters to law enforcement, to media outlets, to libraries, and he just terrorized Wichita. He actually received life without parole, so he's in jail right now. When they ran his case in 2005, when he pled guilty, Kansas didn't have the death penalty at that time, so he received 10 life sentences. I believe it was over 175 years that the judge sentenced him to, which was the most that the judge could give him. And this is Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a cult leader. Under his influence and direction, his cult committed crimes and murders in the California area. And he just passed away actually in November. He was 83 years old. Now, he originally got sentenced to death, and then because of the cases of Greg, California had placed a stay abandoning all death sentences at that time. So his death sentence was commuted to life without parole. So for the whole time that he was alive, he cost the taxpayers over $1 million just in his everyday care, his medical care, to feed him. So in conclusion, capital punishment is constitutional. The Supreme Court, like I said, in a 7-2 ruling, did find that it was constitutional. And as long as it's applied within the provisions of the Supreme Court's, what they outlined, it is constitutional. So contrary to what people say, it is within the law. It's consistent with our theories of corrections, capital punishment as a deterrent, also as a just desert. Like I said, you get a speeding ticket, you pay the fine. You commit a capital offense, you're eligible for a capital sentence. To place limits on capital punishment is to place limits on justice. That's like telling the lawyers, they can't pursue justice to the full extent of the law. You're limiting it, and that's not right. If they committed a capital offense, they should receive a capital sentence. So in conclusion, does the punishment fit the crime? So this individual, like I said, he destroyed families, he destroyed a lot of people's lives, he took security away from the community. Does the punishment fit the crime? Would a life sentence fit what he did? The murders, the lives that he took, the way his respect for human life. Should he be allowed to walk and talk on this earth knowing the crimes that he has committed? And keep in mind, in prisons, you have people, civilians that work in these prisons. There are prison guards, there's nurses, there's counselors. What risk are we putting those law enforcement correctional community? What risk are we putting on them by allowing this offender to walk the unit? Just because he's not walking around in the community does not mean he's not walking around in the prison. He places a risk to other inmates and staff as well. So this guy is just a risk to everybody. And he's shown that in the crimes he's committed and the things that he said on the internet. He is a risk, and we have to treat him as such. If he's found guilty of a capital crime in which he murdered 4 people, sexually assaulted them, he should receive the death sentence. He should receive the death penalty because he is too much of a risk. We can't even have him around other inmates. It would be cruel and unjust to house him for all that time and just wait for him to die. So again, this speech was dedicated to the victims, the survivors, and their fight for justice. A lot of people forget about the victims. They forget about the community. They just see that the state wants to kill someone because they committed a crime. But really, the victims, their justice, and the community's peace of mind, that's what's at stake in these capital cases. Everybody's watching these capital cases. So what message are we sending out to people who may be going through that point in their life where they're thinking about committing a heinous act? That it's okay. You can go and commit a heinous act of murder and it's okay. You'll only receive a life sentence and you'll get 3 square meals a day and you'll get all these programs. I mean, what message are we wanting to send? What message as a society do we want to send to our community and to the world? That you can commit heinous acts of murder and it's okay? Well, there has to be a reprisal for it. There has to be a sentence. If it's a capital case, these are the capital sentencing guidelines that are available. And this is a works cited page. If you want to, there's a lot of information on this topic.